start at 6:02 that morning. Tell me what happened, what you remember.
Well, 6:02 that morning, I was asleep, I thought, and then all of a sudden my wife screamed, and I had reached over instinctively to grab her, and a shell, we had some seashells above the bed, and one of them had fallen down, and I had partially impaled my hand on it. So that's how my day started off with. I gathered my wife, we had a 2-month-old baby and a dog, and got everybody under a door jamb with a transistor radio in what seemed like it must have been 30 seconds. Obviously, it was much, much longer. But we didn't know what had happened. My first thought, honestly and truly, was we finally had a nuclear attack. It was still dark outside, just getting light, so I kind of went to the front door. We were living in Granada Hills at the time. And I opened it up very slowly, and it got blown out of my hand. The Thrifty drugstore up the street on Rinaldi literally blew up from a gas explosion and took the door out of my hand. At that point, I was convinced we were under a nuclear attack. So I tried frantically to get some news on this radio, and finally I was getting some reports of from downtown Los Angeles about an earthquake. They didn't know where it was, just that they had felt it in downtown Los Angeles. That day progressed very quickly. I was working out at Sears Roebuck in San Fernando and living out in Granada Hills. And so my parents were also out there, and I went out to see them. Streets were all buckled, had a heck of a time getting up to Orange Grove Avenue where they live. When I got there, their house was partially or pretty much destroyed. What happened in this quake, there were what they call finger faults. It just simply means smaller little subfaults. And so you would see one house with no damage whatsoever, and then the one next to it completely destroyed, and the one next to it untouched. My parents were somewhat in between. When I got out there, the first thing, my father was building a 42-foot boat in the backyard, which of course had come over on the house. But aside from that, the house, we just started literally with a flat nose shovel and wheelbarrow, just taking the interior of it out, which was about, I don't know, 2.5 feet deep in debris and things from the refrigerator and whatnot. It was a pretty big mess. But when I found out they were okay, and then I next ventured to work where I was a manager there at Sears. And being a kind of an intuitive retailer type guy, I got on the phone when I ascertained it indeed, obviously, was a huge earthquake, and ordered every piece of camping equipment, stoves, hammers, saws, anything I thought would be applicable to, the people needing right away. Literally wiped out our warehouse and ran the store over budget by a couple $1 million. Was told, I might just get fired for that. I really didn't have the authority to do that, but I did. It worked out, of course, very well because we were the only place in town that had things like Coleman lanterns and stoves. As you probably know, the power was out for quite some time. The water was out for even more, and the gas, I don't believe, was restored. I believe it was 8 months until the gas lines were fully restored. I do remember the long lines up at the corner of 5th and Orange Grove. There was a water truck, and it sounds crazy in today's world, and kids today probably wouldn't believe it, but you had to line up for water. And you felt very lucky to go away with your allotment of it because there just wasn't any. There wasn't obviously any toilets running, any faucets, nothing. So it was a really bad situation. But going back to the morning itself, after I got my family squared away, my parents squared away, at that time was a volunteer firefighter. There were about 6 of us young hotshot kids. And we wound up at the Veterans Hospital up in Sylmar. basically a fire had broken out in the midst of the evacuation, and we were trying to keep the flames kind of at bay so they could complete the evacuation of the hospital there. That was a real mess. Never seen anything like it, aside from what was going on in the hospital and the rescue units. On the front lines of the fire, we had deer running out blindly, rabbits, every kind of creature you could think of running into us. Unfortunately, I was pumping out of what's called a hose, a truck pump hose, not for a hydrant. In other words, it's a contained amount of water in a truck, and didn't find out we ran out of water until it ran out. And I got the French fry treatment big time, got burned pretty good. So that was my day. At the end of it, it seemed like literally 3 weeks had gone by with everything that had gotten crammed into it. And again, I had to be in 3 different places. I had a very, very young infant son at the time, so I was keeping tabs on that. And just the thing with the store where I worked at Sears, immediately, I think that evening, the National Guard had set up machine gun nests up on top of the Sears Roebuck building, had a flat roof, as a kind of a insurance against looting or whatever. They didn't really know either, I don't think, at the time. All I know is I escorted 6 guys with very heavy machine gun-like armor up to the roof. Said, knock yourself out.
Well, that building is located in a very strategic place, because you could see pretty much everything from St. Ferdinand's all the way down to the Security Pacific Bank at that time.
Exactly.
And, I remember shopping at that Sears quite often. It became a Goodwill later on. And how old were you at the time?
Oh, let's see.
1971.
I have to do the math here. I think I was 23, just barely 23. I was, at the time, I had already graduated Cal State Northridge, but I was back doing graduate work there at the time.
Okay, go back. It wasn't Cal State Northridge.
Well, it was, okay, I didn't embarrass myself. It was Valley State College.
San Bernardino Valley State College. I know, yeah. I was there too.
Yeah, I have 2 sets of diplomas. One say Valley State College, and then my master's degrees and whatnot, teaching credentials were printed up with the Cal State Northridge.
Really? That's cool. That's cool.
But I wanted the old one because it had Ronald Reagan's signature on the Valley State College. He was governor then. I grew up in the 50s where we had drop drills and whatnot, and you were kind of mentally prepared that there was eventually going to be a nuclear war. And I'm not really one that's gullible, but when things started exploding, yeah, that's what I thought,
Once you got now, where were you living at the time? In Sylmar, in Irwin?
No, I was living in Granada Hills on Rinaldi. Interestingly, to make the trek from where I lived to the Sears, I had to go on Zelza Avenue. A little later on, just moving up a little bit, a couple days, the Van Norman Dam was in the process of failing, and they had police stationed on all those cross streets and had some of the area, in fact, completely evacuated. And they were letting traffic through, I remember, off and on, depending on what the information they were getting as to the condition of the dam. I do remember one scary day when I was coming back from, had gone home for lunch. Again, I had a small baby, and I was coming back to the store, and somebody shouted out of a car window, "The dam broke, the dam broke." And everybody scattered, including the police that were stationed on the corner. Everybody just took off, and in my logic of the moment, I made it pell-mell for San Fernando, figuring that would be the least underwater at the Sears location there than right where I was sitting there on Zelza. That was scary, and again, it was false alarm. Obviously, the dam never did completely fail, although when you look at the pictures of it, it came awfully, awfully close to going.
The they evacuated 80,000 people. Were you one of the evacuees?
We were under not obligatory evacuation. We were under that set of, we advise you to. We really had no place to go, so we stayed in the house there. As I remember, my wife at the time, I think I had put her and our son with my mother-in-law for safety, and but I was still in the house there in Rinaldi.
Yeah, that was a scary thing. The fact that I know we have some video of people saying that you're moving 80,000 people out from under this dam, on top of the fact that people had just experienced an earthquake. Now, the people in Sylmar and San Fernando had it much worse than the earthquake. But if you're on that borderline, like we were talking, whether it was Granada Hills, Sepulveda at the time, or wherever as you move on out that area, that's a double hit. It's like, okay, I've had an earthquake, I've got damage, and now I have to leave my house because my house may not be here because of a flood that might happen.
Well, I had talked to a lot of people that indeed were evacuated, and some just took off. In fact, I had a older fellow working for me at Sears. He literally moved out of his house and went to all places to Long Beach, where of course they've had many earthquakes. But he was scared stiff, he and his wife, and the prospect of that dam going just made it all the more worse. They left, and had somebody sell the house for them. They never came back ever. So I've seen some weird reactions to it. Again, you hear all kinds of things, and at the time we didn't have facts. You're just hearing what you're hearing on the street. But the story that everybody heard was if the dam broke, it would fill the San Fernando Valley Basin to a depth of 4 to 6 feet. I don't think, in retrospect, that's possible, but it wouldn't have been pleasant for people directly in the path of that water, obviously, especially in Granada Hills. We figured we were somewhere in the middle of it. I didn't know that we were right in the middle of it, to be honest. I'm familiar with the San Andreas Fault, and I would have thought maybe a little farther up the line, Lancaster, Palmdale or something, but it was scary. And I don't know anybody that has been through it that wasn't left with a kind of an indelible impression for all time about it. I mean, it's not something you forget, or you don't forget where you were at the time. It's something like the Kennedy assassination. It's a reference point in your life, a very large one.
When you think about that, we've actually talked to some folks that felt they had touch of, or even more serious PTSD type of thing, and over the years, even to the point where not even so much as one lady we talked to, just she left and she goes, I will never live any place where an earthquake is, and she still has issues, and a couple other people have too. Have you had any?
Well, not because of the earthquake itself, but because of the aftershocks. We had months and months of aftershocks. And the thing with the aftershocks, they were quite large, some of them, 5.4, which is like the recent earthquake they just had there. And you'd feel it rumbling up to a point where you didn't know whether it was going to get to a point and stop or just keep going. So that was so unnerving that I remember once we were having some dinner guests when that happened. They just literally went shrieking out of the house, for their car. Me personally, I found it, I guess for even maybe a couple of years after that, the anticipation of, even if it was a small aftershock, is this going to be another huge earthquake? And it was just, your chest would tighten up. I wouldn't call it any kind of post-traumatic stress. It was just the stress of not wanting to have that happen again, and having seen what it did at the full, 7.1 magnitude there. Some of the aftershocks we had, as I recall, were in the high 5s, 5.4, 5.6. which in themselves were pretty good sized little earthquakes. So um, it was really bothersome. I remember that. I remember people that I knew like had nightmares and all that, and I did not. I had obviously trouble sleeping at the slightest tremor because I didn't know what was going to go on next. But I did know people that two people that I know personally had to have sessions with psychologists and stuff, because it interfered with their life. They couldn't even go to work, and they were looking over their shoulder, so to speak, for the next earthquake. It's very disturbing psychologically to go through. I think even more so than a fire or just about any other phenomenon, because you don't know when it's coming, you don't know when it's going to stop, and in the case of an aftershock, you don't know when it's going to level off or if it's going to. So it's a big stress. Yeah, big stress.
You were working right downtown San Fernando, basically 1 block away, and because that's the back of the Penny store and the People's store fronts the Sears store where you were working.
Right.
And so you saw the devastation there. What did you think when I'm sure you drove through it or walked through it at some point, what actually became the San Fernando Mall?
Well, I guess the thing that struck me the most, being kind of young then, I didn't know people lived in those buildings on what's now the mall. And in some of the pictures we have here, they showed that when the fascia went off these buildings, there were beds right up to those walls, and there were people living up there. And most of that stuff was not newer construction; it was older brick work, and it just came down all over the street there. Very, very shortly after the earthquake struck, though, that entire downtown, what became the mall, the street there, was under National Guard, jurisdiction. You couldn't just walk around, in other words. You could get some peeks at it, but they weren't letting people go down the street or, even take pictures or anything. It was completely cordoned off with National Guard.
One of the things that we're going to have a small section of this that deals with crime, because there was some looting, and there was looting. I had newspaper articles. There was looting in places like Granada Hills and stuff for weeks after that because people had left their homes.
Sure.
And so we had that, and of course we had. I know in Sylmar for sure we had police presence. They had roadblocks not letting people in, or unless you were a local resident, and things like that. But also we had a couple of situations where people that didn't have earthquake insurance, commercial buildings, for some reason, 2 weeks later, the place burned down. They had fire insurance, but they didn't have earthquake insurance. And what do you remember? And you're the first one who told us about the National Guard with weapons. We've heard National Guard. What did you see anything, or what did you feel as far as any possible criminal activity? Whether it was the looting, the fact that you had National Guard there with weapons, or if you saw it or heard of anything.
Well, at the store that I worked at, immediately after this quake hit around 6:01, we had some minor, I wouldn't even call it looting. The front window of our building went out and some items were taken. Okay, I wouldn't call it, they didn't enter the store. They just picked up some stuff that was sitting right out there free. We immediately put our in-house security onto that, and plywood and whatnot. I was an assistant manager there at the time, and me and the top guy, put a bunch of plywood up. We did see some looting on the main street there where Castle's Music and Penny's was, but most of it was, I'm a little loath to call it looting, because the stuff that I personally saw were people not entering stores, but on the sidewalk, either reaching in for something behind a window that was no longer there, or picking up something that had toppled out in the pavement and taking off with it. But I mean, compared to what's going on these days, I wouldn't even call that looting. It was grabbing some freebies.
you seem very level-headed and together, and like you were at the time too. You're like, well, people are going to need some Coleman lanterns and such, and you seem very like, okay, this is what's happening. Here's how I'm going to deal with it. Now, is that something that the earthquake kind of focused in you, or is that something you've always been, where you've always just been like, well, how do I deal with the problem so pragmatically?
No,
it's just, again, there's a contrast in how people are reacting. So
no, I've always been that way. I'm a Boy Scout motto, you know, be prepared type guy. I still work with a daily list, even at my age. But back then, because I was pretty good at what I was doing, which was, you know, retailing and merchandising. I knew that just the moment that thing hit, that there was going to be no shovels or rope or hammers or saws or Coleman lanterns and stoves. And so I just ordered everything. That we had a big central warehouse in Los Angeles, Sears did. It was actually for the catalog department. It was supposed to be only for them. And I just had them ship everything they had, literally all pieces of hammers, all pieces of saw, all this, all that, out to our little itty bitty store. And two motives, frankly. Again, being a merchandiser, one of them obviously was make money. You know, the second, and maybe maybe the first was the people I knew were going to need these things, because it was apparent when I drove in that morning from Granada Hills that the gas lines were gone. I mean, and that the electricity was either going to be gone or was already gone. And water I hadn't even thought about. It was, I just can't describe the amount of destruction. I've seen pictures of it, you know, of upheaved streets, but it wasn't just one street like that. It was just miles and miles and miles of devastation, houses completely off their foundations up in Sylmar. There's a famous picture in that magazine that I have of a house that was literally just like he picked it up off its foundation and sat it down, you know, 8 feet the other way. The section that my parents lived in, every house, it was an old orange grove, and that's hence the name of the street, but every house had a brick wall, you know, 3-sided brick wall. Well, for blocks and blocks, it was unimaginable. They all just went down. There was no brick wall anywhere. They all had to be rebuilt. And that's minor, but it wasn't like, you know, 6 houses or 10 or 20. It was hundreds and hundreds of them that these brick walls were all completely destroyed on. So it was, I've seen other natural disasters, and I've, after this, I continued my chores as a volunteer firefighter, and I've seen much worse fires for sure, but I've never, ever, and we've lived overseas, and I've never seen a natural disaster like that quake, with just so many ramifications that people don't think of. I mean, where do you get baby formula for a baby after an earthquake? The short answer, you don't. How do you take care of people that are on respirators? There's just a lot of little things people don't think about, in addition to, oh my God, my house just fell down. You know? As I always tell people, we're still here to talk about it. Unfortunately, and I'd say I've never run into anybody that went through that earthquake that just was nonchalant about it and said, yeah, you know, it was an earthquake, no big thing. Everybody came away a little different person because of it, and also doesn't. I think a lot of people that still have a lot of friends that still live in Sylmar, they do kind of live with a little bit of over-the-shoulder fear that that's going to happen again. Yeah.